If you look closely at the seismic shifts occurring between Washington and Ottawa right now, you'll realize we aren't witnessing a standard trade negotiation. This isn't a disagreement over percentages or minor regulatory hurdles. This is a high-velocity ultimatum meeting an immovable wall. For nearly a century, the economic relationship between the United States and Canada was the envy of the industrialized world. It was a masterpiece of integration, seamless, mutually beneficial, and so deeply intertwined that the border was almost invisible to capital and commerce. But as of 1:15 p.m. this afternoon, that relationship has been placed on life support. Donald Trump didn't just ask for a revision of terms, he demanded $500 billion from Canada, not over a 10-year horizon, not as a phased adjustment within a trade framework, but immediately. He wants it in concessions, in unfettered market access, in resource guarantees, and in what his inner circle is calling balance of trade restitution. He went on Truth Social and laid it out with the coldness of a collection agency. He presented it like an invoice, as if Canada owed him money for the privilege of being a neighbor. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a landlord showing up at your breakfast table and claiming you've been underpaying rent since the 1990s, then demanding the difference in cash before noon. But Washington made a catastrophic strategic error. They sent that demand to the wrong man. Mark Carney is not a typical career politician. He didn't look for a diplomatic exit ramp. He looked at that bill, read every line with the clinical detachment of a central banker, and then did something that sent shockwaves through every embassy, every trading floor, and every war room in the Western world. He didn't just reject the demand, he dismantled the very logic it stood on. And the way he did it has shaken Washington to its foundational stones. While the experts on cable news are arguing over the optics, they are missing the actual story. The economic map of North America is being redrawn in real time. To understand the gravity of the situation, we have to look at where this $500 billion figure actually originated. It didn't come from a Treasury audit or a Department of Commerce study. It came from pure, unadulterated frustration. For months, the White House has been hammering a narrative that America is being ripped off by its northern neighbor. They've pointed to Canadian lumber, Canadian energy, and Canadian metals as proof of a lopsided deal. The Trump team put together what can only be described as a grievance manifesto, a document that calculated every perceived imbalance, every tariff asymmetry, and every market restriction that allegedly favors Canadian producers over American ones. They added up 3 decades of trade data, inflated the timeline, padded the numbers with opportunity costs, and arrived at the staggering sum of $500 billion. The White House claim is that Canada owes this to the American people for decades of predatory trade practices. Now, if you ask any serious economist, Republican or Democrat, they will tell you this number is pure fantasy. Trade deficits are not credit card debts. You don't get to just send a bill for a deficit accrued under a previous treaty. That isn't how international law or macroeconomics works. But here's the thing. Donald Trump doesn't care about economic theory. He cares about the headline. He knows that Trump demands $500 billion from Canada plays beautifully in the Rust Belt. It lights up his base. It makes him look like the tough-talking CEO finally holding freeloaders accountable. Washington expected Ottawa to panic. They expected a flurry of phone calls and a desperate plea for a middle ground. But they forgot who they were dealing with. Mark Carney doesn't panic. He calculates. Mark Carney is a different breed of leader. He isn't Justin Trudeau. He isn't going to smile, nod, and try to find a progressive common ground over a round of golf. Carney has run the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He is a man who thinks in basis points and systemic risk, not in tweets and optics. When that $500 billion demand hit his desk, he didn't call the White House. He called a press conference. It was a masterclass in controlled defiance, a performance that will be studied in political science and grand strategy classes for the next 50 years. Standing at a podium in Ottawa, looking as calm as a surgeon about to make the first incision, he looked directly into the camera and said, "The United States is our partner, not our landlord. Canada does not pay tribute. We do not accept invoices from foreign governments, and we will not be bullied by fantasy accounting. That single sentence landed in Washington like a precision-guided cruise missile. Within minutes, it was the most shared clip on the planet. Within an hour, European leaders were privately and some publicly signaling their support. By the time the White House press office realized they needed to respond, they were already behind the narrative curve. The Trump response was predictable: chaos. He fired back immediately, calling Carney a failed globalist banker and a puppet of the elites. He threatened an immediate 50% tariff on all Canadian goods. Not 10%, not 25%, 50%. He declared that Canada would pay one way or another. But while the president was raging on social media, the markets, the real arbiters of power, were already delivering a devastating verdict for the White House. Let's look at the receipts. Let's look at the actual damage. Receipt number 1 is the bond market. Within 45 minutes of Carney finishing his statement, U.S. Treasury yields spiked. Now, for those who don't follow the bond market, a spike in yields during a crisis means one thing: the market is pricing in instability and risk. Investors didn't see the $500 billion demand as a sign of American strength. They saw it as a sign of American recklessness. They saw a president who was willing to blow up the largest, most stable bilateral trade relationship on Earth just to win a news cycle. The bond market is the one thing in this world that doesn't lie. It doesn't care about your political rallies or your follower count. It prices in the cold, hard reality of risk. And yesterday, it priced in the risk that the United States was becoming an unreliable actor. That shiver went through every portfolio manager in New York and London. If the U.S. can do this to its closest ally, they realized, it can do it to anyone. Capital started looking for the exit. Now, let's talk about the auto sector. This is where Trump's demand gets personal for his own voters. The American auto industry hasn't been purely American for decades. It is a North American machine. A single vehicle manufactured by General Motors or Ford crosses the US-Canada border up to 8 times during the production process. The engines are machined in Ontario. The transmissions are assembled in Michigan. The wiring harnesses come from Quebec. The electronics come from Ohio. It is one giant, synchronized machine spread across 2 sovereign nations. When Trump threatened a 50% tariff on that border, he wasn't just threatening Canada, he was threatening to decapitate Detroit. Ford stock dropped 4% in a single afternoon. GM dropped 3.5%. Stellantis dropped 5%. Why? Because those investors know that a 50% tariff doesn't hurt Ottawa, it kills Dearborn. It kills Oshawa. It kills the thousands of small parts suppliers in Indiana and Wisconsin that depend on that just-in-time cross-border integration. We are getting reports that the CEOs of the Big Three requested an emergency audience with the president to explain this reality. They were told he was unavailable, he was too busy on Truth Social calling Carney names. While the very industrial base he promised to protect was catching fire, the president was focused on the feud. This is the receipt that should terrify every American watching this video. Washington has long operated on the arrogant assumption that Canada has nowhere else to sell its energy. They think Canada is a captive supplier. They are wrong. Canada supplies more energy to the United States than any other country on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the entire OPEC coalition combined. The pipelines that feed the American Midwest, the refineries in Texas that process heavy crude, the natural gas that heats the homes of the Blue Wall, states it all comes from the north. 60% of all U.S. crude imports flow south from Alberta. In his press conference, Carney didn't need to make a loud threat. He didn't need to shout. He just said one sentence that every energy trader from Singapore to Geneva understood instantly. He said, "Canada will ensure its resources serve its national interest first." That's all it took. Within 90 minutes, West Texas Intermediate crude jumped $6 a barrel. Natural gas futures went vertical. Energy stocks in Toronto surged, while their American counterparts started to wobble. Carney didn't say he was cutting off the oil, he just reminded the world that he could. He reminded Washington that if Canada chooses to pivot its energy exports toward Asia via the newly expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline, the lights in the American Midwest don't just get more expensive, they might go out. That is what a $500 billion demand gets you when the debtor you're bullying controls your gas tank. It gets you a price spike that hits every voter at the pump in the exact swing states Trump needs for his survival. Receipt number 4 is perhaps the most significant in terms of long-term grand strategy: the international response. Trump's goal was to isolate Canada, to make them feel small and alone so they would fold. Instead, he isolated himself. While the White House was throwing punches, the rest of the world was picking up the phone to call Ottawa. Our sources in Brussels confirm that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, called Carney within 3 hours of his press conference. The UK Prime Minister's office issued a rare, pointed statement, expressing deep concern about unilateral demands that undermine the rules-based order. And then, there was Japan. The Japanese Trade Ministry released a one-line statement that said more than any hour-long speech could: Japan stands with its partners who uphold multilateral trade principles. Translation: the entire developed world just rallied behind Canada. They saw Carney stand up and say, no. And every country that has ever been threatened by a Trump tariff, every nation that has been called a freeloader, they all felt a surge of adrenaline. They realized that if Canada can defy the ultimatum, so can they. Carney didn't just reject a bill. He became the recruiter for a global coalition against American economic unilateralism. This is a strategic miscalculation that historians will write about for decades. You don't make a $500 billion demand unless you are 100% certain the other side will buckle. Trump was certain because that's how it's always worked for him. He threatens, they cave, he declares victory, and moves on. But Carney broke the pattern. He snapped the playbook in half. And now, the White House is standing in the wreckage of its own strategy, trying to figure out why the quiet neighbor suddenly has teeth. Why is Carney so different? It's because he doesn't think in terms of the next news cycle. He thinks in systems. This is a man who navigated the 2008 financial crisis in Canada, the only G7 country that didn't have a single bank failure. He navigated the Bank of England through the chaotic aftermath of the Brexit vote. He is a man who has sat across the table from the most powerful and ruthless financial minds on the planet and consistently outmaneuvered them. He doesn't react to threats. He models them. He runs the scenarios. He stress tests the outcomes, and only then does he act. When Trump sent that demand, Carney didn't panic call his cabinet. He spent 4 hours in a secure room with his economic team, modeling every possible U.S. retaliation. He identified every single pressure point in the American economy, and then he built a response designed to do maximum strategic damage to the Trump coalition, with minimum economic disruption to Canada. Look at what he did tactically. He didn't announce broad, sweeping tariffs on all American goods. That would have been a blunt instrument that hurt Canadian consumers. Instead, he announced strategic reciprocity. He targeted bourbon from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's home state. He targeted agricultural equipment from Iowa. He targeted tech components from Texas. He isn't fighting the U.S. economy. He is fighting the Republican caucus. He knows that Trump can only sustain this fight if his party holds the line. So, Carney is making it impossibly, painfully expensive for Republican senators to stay quiet. Within 24 hours, we've already seen 3 GOP senators call for dialogue and de-escalation. That is Senate speak for, Mr. President, you're killing our donors and our districts. Stop. So, where does this go? I see 3 possible paths, and none of them look particularly good for Washington. Path 1 is the standoff. Trump imposes the tariffs. Carney retaliates with his surgical precision. The border slows to a crawl. Prices in America begin to skyrocket. The auto industry begins mass layoffs. Eventually, after months of economic agony, corporate America and the Senate force the White House to the table. A deal is patched together that looks remarkably like the one we already had. It won't be pretty, but it'll stop the bleeding. Path 2 is the spiral. Trump, enraged by Carney's defiance, loses his temper entirely. He invokes emergency powers, tries to block all energy imports, and threatens to pull out of NATO. Canada, in response, pivots entirely to the EU and Asia. This triggers a full-blown continental recession. Gas hits $7 a gallon. the stock market drops 20%. We're talking about a global depression triggered by one man's refusal to back down from a number he made up on a Saturday morning. Path 3 is the quiet retreat. A back-channel envoy, perhaps the Treasury Secretary, quietly reaches out to Ottawa to negotiate a face-saving deal. Trump gets to claim he won a historic concession, even if it's minor. And Carney gets to keep Canada's sovereignty and resources intact. This is what the markets are praying for, but I don't think Trump's ego allows for Path 3. He drew a line at $500 billion. He said it repeatedly. To walk that back would require admitting that his invoice was fiction. And Donald Trump does not admit fiction. We are watching two men play the most dangerous game of chicken in human history. On one side, you have a leader screaming, swerving, and honking the horn, relying on brute force and the belief that the other side must eventually cave. On the other side, you have a man with both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the horizon, cruise control set, and a stack of economic data on the passenger seat telling him exactly how much road is left. Carney knows the math. He knows Canada will take damage, he's accepted that. But he also knows that the United States will take more. Because the American economic model was built on the assumption that Canada would always be the quiet, compliant partner. You take that away, and the American model doesn't just stumble, it breaks. That is the leverage Carney holds. And he is the first Canadian leader in a generation who knows exactly how to use it. This is the state of the most important alliance in North America. This is what happens when you treat your best friend like a debtor. Carney proved something yesterday that Washington hasn't heard in a very long time. No. One word. 2 letters. And it shook the most powerful government on earth. The question now isn't whether this will hurt. It will. The question is, who bleeds more? And right now, the smart money is betting on the man with the spreadsheet, not the man with the smartphone. Do you think Trump will back down? Or is this the moment the world finally realizes that you can say no to Washington and survive? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to know what happens when the markets open tomorrow, and believe me, they will react violently, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is on. This story is moving faster than anything I've covered in years. The $500 billion question is on the table, and the answer just changed everything.